In my 50 years of scenario planning, I've never seen uncertainty like that arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. That's what our next guest said this summer, and he sure has the experience to say so. As a futurist and business strategist, he develops scenarios for the future, and he has been doing so for the last 50 years. He is Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning for Salesforce. And today he will share some tips on how to deal with this massive uncertainty. We are very happy to have him. Welcome, Peter Schwartz.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Peter, in 2003, you published a book called Inevitable Surprises, Thinking Ahead in Times of Turbulence. And I feel like you could have written this book in 2020. I think it's safe to say that this year, the whole world got hit by surprise by the virus, and we are definitely experiencing times of turbulence. Is the coronavirus one of those inevitable surprises?
Yes, it is. And it's a perfect example, as a matter of fact. This was not a surprise to many people. Because we've had pandemics before, right? We've even had some fairly recently. The most recent that most people noted was SARS in Southeast Asia. So this is not a completely unique event. And in fact, many different organizations did scenarios looking at the future of potential pandemics. I worked on two of them myself, one with the government of Singapore and another with the Rockefeller Foundation. So this was a perfectly foreseeable event. What we didn't know is exactly when or which virus it would be, but this was an ideal situation for trying to see and manage uncertainty.
And yet many people and many organizations were not quite prepared for this event. You, as an expert in scenario planning, how did you approach the situation? You mentioned you worked with the government of Singapore. How do you plan for an event like that?
Well, that's a great example because, in fact, Singapore was well prepared. And if you look at the actual experience of the pandemic, very few countries have done as well as Singapore. So the first thing that they did was to recognize that they had to see it early. So, in fact, I was in Singapore in December and having lunch with the deputy prime minister. And he said, I've just been picking up some interesting stuff coming out of Wuhan. I think we should start preparing here in Singapore. And that's what they did. And they'd already had plans in place, technology in place. They were quite well prepared and were quick to move to put in place the necessary measures to deal with the pandemic. The important thing that suggests is if you've thought about it, if you've done the scenarios, then you will recognize the early signals faster than everybody else. This was a gentleman named Tharman, and Tharman basically said, we've thought about this before. We're picking up the signal. I don't know yet if it's going to be important, but we're going to start preparing. That's what good scenario planning does. It prepares the mind's eye to recognize the early signals of change.
I was wondering, the world has been complex and uncertain before, but I think that COVID-19 put this to a whole new level.
Yes.
What can companies and organizations learn from the way futurists like you deal with crises?
Well, the truth is you can most often see these things coming if you ask yourself the hard and sometimes awkward questions. What could really put us at risk? Where are our greatest vulnerabilities? And then you start thinking through the scenarios. And then you also try to say, all right, if those are real, what do we need to do to prepare for it, to prevent it, to take advantage of it in some cases? The honest truth is Salesforce is doing quite well, thank you. We just released our results last quarter. We did very well. We released them last week. And the reason is everybody's moving to a digital world. So we've moved quickly to pivot the company to take advantage of this opportunity that the pandemic has created. It's suffering for the world, but there are organizations that have actually been able to do well in the face of this because they thought about it, prepared, and moved quickly. But to do that, you have to have thought about it before. You've had to develop the scenario. So that's the point. Think through the possibilities, think through the different scenarios, places of greatest vulnerability, be prepared and recognize the signals in a timely way.
And it also certainly helps to be a technology company in these times, to be fair, right?
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
What you mentioned that you can see different scenarios for the imminent future, let's say the next 6 months. What kind of scenarios are there?
Well, obviously now things are looking up a bit because we now know something we didn't know when I did the original scenarios last spring. And that is, we know that a vaccine is possible. And that we now have at least 3 vaccines that are coming into the market, and there will probably be many more. So what does that mean? It now is very much a function of the scenarios of 2 things: how effective we are in distributing that vaccine, how quickly we get it into people. And secondly, there are still enormous economic consequences of what has already happened, and frankly, what will continue to happen for the next, I'll call it 3 to 6 months, as we're still responding to the current situation with the economy. Do governments do the right thing to support their economy? Does the US government put up another stimulus package? Does France, UK, Germany, and so on? Do all of these countries take the necessary steps to support the economy? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, i.e. they're very effective in distributing the vaccine and they're effective in responding to the virus, to the economy, then probably by mid-year in much of the world, we'll begin to see the crisis ebbing and the world will begin to look like a much better place. However, there's another scenario, and that the governments are not as adept in getting it out, that people resist taking the virus, that it turns out there are problems we didn't anticipate, either in manufacturing or distribution, or side effects we didn't see coming. And if we don't also at the same time to handle the economy well, it's entirely possible the economic consequences will be worse and drag out. So there's a second scenario, basically based on a combination of bad luck and incompetence that leads to a much longer period of recovery, i.e. rather than coming back by mid-year next year, it's more like a year or 2 from now before we really see significant recovery.
And you just described the best case and worst case scenario.
Yes.
Which one of this is more likely in your opinion?
Well, right now, I'd have to say that I'm leaning toward the best case in most of the world. I mean, things seem to be breaking in good direction. We've had a good election in the United States. We now have an incoming competent administration that actually believes there is a pandemic. I mean, Mr. Trump is still denying that it actually exists, right? So you can't solve it if you don't think it's real, right? So we actually have a president who has some intelligence and judgment and capability. So that augurs very well for the United States, i.e. that we will get the virus under control and we will do the right things economically.
Yeah, intelligence sure helps. That's true. Since we're speaking about strategic future planning, Salesforce made a pretty big strategic decision last week to acquire the work messenger Slack. For, I think, $27.7 billion.
That's right.
Is that a bet on a future that is filled with remote work?
Yes, and it's not only that, but certainly it is a big part of that. We think that one of the outcomes of the pandemic is that a very large number of people in a variety of functions will still wish to stay at home. Not just because it's safer and so on. That's really convenient. Look, I will never go back to the office. I'm never going to go back to 8 hours a week of commuting. It takes me 45 minutes to go from my home in Berkeley to the Salesforce office every day and 45 minutes to come home. I just gained all that time back. I'm not going to give it back. I want to keep it.
So you haven't been there since March?
No. Having said that, I'm not unique. There's a lot of people. I'd say about half of people who work in an office are never going to go back. And so that means that the opportunity to serve those people in a great variety of functions is, I think, quite extensive. So we do see that as very real. We also see something else, that is that now almost everything that people do in business involves some form of collaboration inside the organization, outside the organization, among various organizations. And it's why Microsoft Teams, why Slack, why Google Meets, all of these things have been doing very well, and for good reason. It's the nature of the way in which business has evolved. It's true for our customers. It's true for Salesforce. So what we want to do is be able to enable that collaboration to happen seamlessly, not only with Salesforce, but remember, there are many other applications that people will use. 2 years ago, or now almost 3 years ago, we acquired a company called MuleSoft. And MuleSoft is an integration platform. And what that enables us to do is to take any other application and instantly integrate it with Slack and with Salesforce. So our view is that, the day is not far off, and I mean, it's weeks, not months or years, where the average person will work in Slack all day and will go to Salesforce some of the time. They may go to Workday another part of the time. They may go to a sales application, a healthcare application another moment, and so on. So what you will see them is living in Slack and moving into their applications from there in a highly collaborative environment.
I see. Now, I went to your Twitter page a few days ago, and your Twitter bio says, I help people think about the future.
Yeah.
And can you maybe give some tips? How can one think more like a futurist?
Sure. There's a few very obvious things. The most important, when I hire people to be on my staff, I look for a unique quality, which I call a ruthless curiosity. You're real hungry to know about science, about politics, about art, about culture, about history, about geography. That desperate desire to know stuff, and then to ask yourself hard questions. As I've explored the world, how could I be wrong? What are the things where I could get it wrong, either on the upside, the downside, or difference? So you're kind of asking yourself the question, all the time, challenging your own mental map. We operate with a kind of mental map of how the world works. And that map was developed with history. But the problem is the world is changing so fast. So you want to challenge your mental map. You want to constantly ask yourself hard questions. A good way to do that is have friends and colleagues who do that for you, who challenge your thinking. Fortunately, I live in an organization and I have a community of people around me who are constantly challenging my thinking. That's a very helpful thing, is that to deal with people who you don't agree with necessarily. So it's a combination of ruthless curiosity, gathering more intelligence on the one hand, and challenging your own mental maps, your own assumptions. From that is the other important thought quality you need to have to be a good futurist.
It's interesting because many people tend to, gather around like-minded people and don't like to be challenged as much. So I think
exactly.
That's a good tip. AI is, predicts the future by seeing patterns in the past. How much does this mirror how you work?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes, with one very important exception. Look, yes, I spend a lot of time absorbing data, just like a good machine learning piece of algorithm does, right? That's how a machine learning AI works. Lots of data fed to an algorithm that then makes sense of it. But it's only as good as the data, as history, right? The problem is the future is often surprising, and that's the issue. Look, good scenario planning involves rigorous analysis on the one hand, much as an AI might do, but creative imagination on the other. It's a combination of those two things together. That is, you need both that rigorous analysis that an AI is competent to do, but you also need that creative mind. Look, many years ago, I helped write a movie called Minority Report. I brought a team of experts together, and we looked at all the important trends that were shaping the future for Steven Spielberg when we were making that movie. But the reason that it actually turned out to be remarkably perceptive is that not only was it based on kind of rigorous analysis of computer interfaces or urban design and so on, but a lot of creative imagination. Us sitting in a conference room coming up with it would not have produced what was on screen without Spielberg, without the script writers, without the art directors and so on, to bring that raw data to life in a kind of creative vision.
If Steven Spielberg or some other director had approached you last year with a movie script describing 2020, as a year in which we experience a pandemic and wildfires and political unrest and a president who doesn't accept the election results, what would have been your reaction?
I probably would have said bad science fiction. Too much. But the truth is that is the reality that we actually experience. There was a very good film that had much of this in it a few years ago called Contagion. That actually it was put out with it precisely in the mind to warn the world. The Skoll Foundation and their program on global problems actually produced the film, commercial success of a film that got much of the pandemic right. And it was meant as a warning to the world. If you look at that film today, it turns out to be pretty good.
Yeah, but maybe not the right people have watched it.
Yes, unfortunately, most people didn't take it seriously enough.
What do you think, last question, if we look back to this day in 20 years, which developments will have stayed and maybe even changed things for the better?
Very good question. Look, I think there is change happening now so fast that what might have taken a decade or more is happening in months. So let me give you 2 or 3 quick examples. I mean, the first is work from home. And so, yes, we were gradually moving toward more and more people being able to commute digitally and so on. Now there's a huge rush, and that's not going to go back to the old world. So that's, that work from home. Digital retail, right? Yeah, Amazon existed and people were already ordering online. I'm never going to buy laundry detergent at the store again. It's always going to be delivered to my house. When I want a beautiful new suit, I'm going to go to my great tailor, and I'm going to have a great experience, and he's going to give me espresso and champagne and so on. So we're going to see retail change in a very big way. Business travel. We're going to do a whole lot less business travel because now we know that I don't need to fly to Germany for a 1-hour meeting. I can do this digitally and remotely. Tourist travel will come back because people still want to go to beautiful places. But business travel, half of that's going to disappear permanently. The world will be much greener. We'll drive less, fly less, and so on. And that's already happened from the pandemic. So basically what I'm saying is that some of the accelerating change that has come from the pandemic is going to stick. A lot of the remote work, the retail, education, that will stay. The movement toward greater sustainability, I think that will stay. So what we're seeing now is, I think, a wholesale shift in 2 fundamental directions, much more of a digital environment and a much more sustainable environment. I think when we look back from 20 years ago, we'll say that was the moment when all of that accelerated.
Okay, so most of it sounds like a really optimistic scenario.
Yes,
so
it is. I do.
I hope you're right. And thank you very much, Peter. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot from it.
My pleasure. Happy to be with you.